Welcome everyone to this FWR webinar, Distributed Low-Cost Monitoring for Nature-Based Solutions to Flood and Drought Risk with FreeStation. This webinar has been organised as part of the work of the Water Resources and Quality Technical Panel of the FWR community. And this webinar will explore techniques for in-field monitoring of the effectiveness of natural flood management interventions through the development and deployment of open-source, low-cost DIY sensors. We are delighted to be joined by Mark Mulligan, Professor of Physical and Environmental Geography at King's College London and Honorary Fellow of UN Environment World Conservation Monitoring Centre. His research involves fieldwork around the world, and he is also a developer of a range of open-source, web-connected instruments for environmental monitoring through the FreeStation and FreeSensor initiatives. As always with our webinars, there will be a chance for questions at the end of the presentation, so please do submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen, and you can do this at any point during the presentation, and I will then ask these on your behalf later on. Thank you all for logging in, and thanks again to Mark. I'll now hand over to you.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to speak on this topic. So what I'm going to do today is this broad outline in around 30 minutes. We're going to talk about some of the challenges of monitoring natural flood management as opposed to other types of flood management. We're going to talk about low-cost do-it-yourself monitoring solutions like the one you see in the picture there. And then I'm going to go through some deployments over the years for the DEFRA NFM pilot program 2017 to 21 through a number of EU-funded research projects, and in our current project working on the Catchment to Coast, which is a flood and coastal resilience program project. As a result of talking about those deployments and the methods associated, we'll look at some key findings on natural flood management, although our focus today really is more the technology, and then a few quick conclusions. Now, there's a lot of detail on this slide. I don't need you to read it. I'll make the slides available to you. But when it comes to natural flood management, the problem with monitoring natural flood management is that leaky dams, retention ponds, soil management regimes vary in design and scale. So you can't just monitor one and hope that the results of that apply to others. Also, because their effectiveness depends on their hydrological and geographical context, where they are in the catchment and what the land use and everything else around them is like. But also natural flood management tends to be small investments in often semi-urban catchments where expensive monitoring is either not feasible with the budget or is not possible because you're in very vulnerable sites. And so our approach to natural flood management monitoring has been, on the one hand, to monitor a wide range of interventions extensively. So natural flood management projects throughout different parts, as you see, of Southeast England here, rather than focusing intensively at a single site. That's to tackle this geographical heterogeneity issue. The other issue with natural flood management is that monitoring is always expensive in three ways, because of the specialist equipment, of course, and the sensors. And in NFM context, they are particularly vulnerable to vandalism and theft because you're often working on the edge of communities. You're not in remote wilderness areas. There's often associated infrastructure such as measurement weirs or other structures to take measurements. And of course, there's a lot of time taken to visit, collect, and analyze data. And if you're doing an extensive network, those costs can build up. So our focus in natural flood management has been to use this technology that we have been developing called FreeStation, which are network connected, low cost, do-it-yourself build sensors, and to develop analytical tools that bring the data from multiple sensors together and allow specific types of analyses that are replicable between different sensor configurations. And so during the 2017 to 2021 NFM program, we were able to monitor 13 rivers, as you see there. we were able to build and deploy more than 100 FreeStation data loggers, collecting around 20 million readings a year across all of those projects. And since that program, we've maintained long-term intensive monitoring sites on natural flood management at Spain's Hall Estate, where we still have 33 loggers, and in our FCRIP project, where there are 51 data loggers. And what do I mean by FreeStation? Well, we have developed and open sourced a wide variety of instruments, all of which are good enough for what we want them to do, but are not so good that they're very, very expensive. They're designed with consumer off-the-shelf and thus cheap components. We've designed them so that all parts are easily replaceable, and stations can be recycled or reconfigured into other stations once they've had one life as a stage station. They can become a weather station, or they can become something else. We've made them easy to build and easy to install. We've made them network enabled. We've open sourced the designs for non-commercial uses, and we've built a lot of them. We built around 850 data loggers since 2014, and collected a huge amount of data with that, and developed tools to bring dense networks of station data together and analyze them around topics like NFM, but other topics as well. And I should say that, low cost does not necessarily mean low accuracy, precision, or quality of sensing. Low cost means we are dealing with non-specialist consumer mass-produced sensors that you might find in a washing machine, in a car, in a fridge, all these sorts of things. They're good enough quality to be used in those important functions, but many of them are used, and therefore they're low cost. However, we're putting them to new purposes, and therefore we do have to sort of test and calibrate our sensors against other standards. And the enabling technological advance that allows us now to build our own data loggers is the advent of low-cost microprocessors like this one here. This is one of my old data loggers, probably 30 years old, this data logger. And, these are difficult, they're expensive, they're big, and they're not as powerful as something, to the same scale, this size, and a tiny fraction of the cost. So it's the availability of these microprocessors that, allow us to control a data logging function, plus low-cost sensors, that enable us to build our own field equipment now. And we've been doing that since 2014 with FreeStation. We started off with microprocessors called Arduinos that you may know of, and we built a whole series of generation 1 data loggers around the Arduino. We then moved from that platform just because at the time it was limited in terms of memory and therefore functionality, to our generation 2, which were based on particle microprocessors. Again, these are low cost, less than £20. And that enabled us also to go from a sort of just saving data locally on an SD card to connecting these microprocessors directly through Wi-Fi or through telephone networks. And now we're on our 3rd generation based on, again, a low-cost, a very versatile microprocessor called S32, of which we have both local saving to SD card locally and live directly connected stations. And you can see some examples here of different kinds of stations. The soil moisture station here, we have a sonar that is detecting the river stage, and then we've got a couple of weather stations. And here's a bunch more stuff that we've built. So, for example, this one here is a LiDAR that we use to generate profiles of rivers, channels, and ditches. Again, based on the same low-cost processing. Stage sensors, a classroom demonstration sensor, water quality and rainfall, air pollution, weather, and all sorts of other things. I mentioned our current sort of generation of stations is these S32 loggers. The nice thing about those is that they come in a variety of footprints, from tiny little things that only have allow you to have a few instruments, to much larger things with many more ports for a variety of instruments. They're low power, so they don't require much in terms of battery, and sometimes you don't even need a solar panel with them. If you're in a very vulnerable situation, then you can produce a data logging water level that looks like this, of very little interest to anyone in terms of theft or vandalism. And where you are leaving them much longer before you visit them, then of course you can add a solar panel like this. So our smallest data logger fits in a test tube like this, and that's very versatile. So to give you an idea of the kinds of deployments, I mentioned we worked a lot in the NFM pilot program, working for a number of the different projects that were installing NFM to do monitoring. We did that for them, but also as part of an EU funded project. And these are some of the places that we worked, looking at a variety of different NFMs, regenerative agriculture, leaky dams, retention ponds, and beaver reintroduction. At the moment, much of our work is around this catchment to coast project, which is a flood and coastal resilience innovation program led by Southend-on-Sea with Thurrock and other councils in the area of the Thames estuary. There we're looking at a very short, highly urbanized, low storage catchment, where there's a need to reduce flood risk, fluvial and pluvial flood risk in the upper, mid and lower parts of that catchment through NFM in the upper, such as leaky dams, in the mid through water storage in existing green spaces, and in the lower parts through more sustainable urban drainage systems. And our work there is really to understand the hydrological baseline, because there's very little monitoring on these small rivers and ditches, and so to understand how they work, but also to test these interventions once they're in place, so that we can see how they're performing and how they perform under different conditions and how they perform in different places. And so we've set up a network of these low-cost sensors around the area. This is the northern part of the Thames estuary in Essex. This is Canvey Island here. And you can see we've got a number of rivers where we've got the blue level sensors, we've got yellow weather stations, and a bunch of other things in place as well. So in total, there are around 51 data loggers covering this area, really intensifying our understanding of which ditches and which streams are producing all of the runoff for particular types of events. And, we put weather stations and we put stage sensors where we can, and so we're working with local organizations. You see some of these are in areas where boats are stored. Others of them are at schools or allotments and so on, and having these just enables us to better understand where the intense bursts of rain are falling. These are the stage gauges we have in that area. You can see a variety of different types here. This is a pressure-based stage gauge, low cost. These are resistance-based, accurate to a millimeter, so they're better for small ditches with a low range. And then we also use sonar, actually parking sensor, car parking sensor based devices where we don't want to put a post in the channel, and we can strap those to a footbridge instead. So on to NFM, the kinds of things we're interested in are the whole variety of different types of natural flood management. And you might classify them into these two basic types: a sort of point source NFM, like a retention pond or a beaver dam or a leaky debris dam, and they operate at a point. or an aerial natural flood management where you change the land management over a large area rather than working in the streams and ditches, and that it enables you to store more water in the land. So something like good soil management, something like regenerative agriculture, where you're doing less ploughing, for example, could be an example of that. And we combine our monitoring with modeling. We have a very widely used modeling tool called WaterWorld that we developed over the last 20 years. And it also looks at water storage in the landscape. Here's a UK scale analysis of that. And we can see, yeah, water bodies store a lot of water, but only in a relatively small area. Canopies store water wherever they are, and of course, because they release some of that water back to the atmosphere, it's kept out of the hydrological system and is replenished from the atmosphere. So they're pretty good at storage. Wetlands, again, they're important, but only upstream of certain places because they're not everywhere. You don't find them everywhere. Floodplains, of course, you find them in many places. And they store amount of water, but you often don't want to use them because we build on them and we have agricultural land on them. So that storage maybe we don't want to use. Soils, again, they're everywhere, and if they're well managed, they can store a lot of water. Of course, we cover them up in urban areas, so they're less effective. And then the total brings all of those together. And what I want to say here really is that the two big stores are canopies and soils. So natural flood management can be a big part of flood management because they are already the big stores, and if they're well managed, then they will be much more effective. So how do we go about understanding natural flood management? Well, I mentioned earlier on that we're often looking at measuring a baseline and then measuring the impact of an intervention. If we are wanting to monitor river discharge baseline, then that's useful for understanding which streams and which ditches lead to flooding. You can't always do that from modeling because you don't always have good soil data for modeling. So, having small sensors for periods on all the tiny streams and ditches is important to work out where your water is coming from, and that helps you to spatially target interventions. So put them in the rivers that are causing problems and to understand the impact of that. And we would use a stage gauge. I mentioned the 3 different types. They're around £80 to build, the resistance, sonar, or pressure types. And then we'd use them in combination because we're only measuring stage. If we wanted to get the cross-sectional area, we would use the FreeStation LiDAR to get that. And we would come up with data like this, so rainfall from a weather station, and then the associated stage data or unit discharge data after processing from one of our stations. If we want to monitor the impact of an intervention, then we have to change the design a little bit. We need to think about having more than one station. We need a data logger monitoring upstream and downstream of the intervention or the network of interventions. So here is an upstream monitor on 11 leaky debris dams, for example. So we need upstream and downstream. And when we have upstream and downstream and we look at the data, we should find, if the intervention is effective, that the downstream orange here of those interventions has an impact on reducing the peaks and extending the low flows. We would then also put another gauge at what we call the asset at risk, so nearby, downstream, the village, the town, where the flooding is an issue. And of course, what we do that for is because we want to know the extent to which this difference, what percentage of the flood peak at the asset at risk is this? In other words, are these interventions significant? Sometimes we're not interested in that, but we're interested in the performance of the intervention, just one of them, and understanding its behavior. So here's an example there where we have just one leaky debris dam here, and we have a parking sensor based sonar downstream, upstream, monitoring the height of the water. And we're able, under different storm events, to understand, how quickly water's building up behind this, how slowly it's leaking through this, and so on. So, we can understand the behavior of that and then multiply that up by the other similar dams that are further upstream, as well as perhaps doing upstream and downstream of the whole lot. So that's thinking about interventions in terms of natural flood management in channels and so on. If we're interested in soil as a means of natural flood management, then monitoring soil moisture and evapotranspiration as a baseline can involve a station like this, which is on a field, the edge of a field, with sensors like this underground, helping us to understand how much water is going into the soil, how much water therefore is flowing over the land, the difference between the incoming soil moisture and the rainfall. And we can do that at different depths, like we see here. You can see the rainfall events leading to stronger peaks in the shallow probe than the deep probe. And that, of course, enables us to understand the storage dynamics of this field. If we want to look at an intervention in an agricultural context, then we would need two of these types of data loggers. We would need to identify soil moisture dynamics in a field under an intervention, such as regenerative agriculture, reducing tillage, for example, and then a neighboring field, same climate, same geology, same soil, that was under a different management technique, so counterfactual. And we would put moisture sensors at the edges of both of those fields, with the sensors themselves under the operational farming area. And then we would have a stage logger or discharge calculation, again, downstream of those fields, on the streams and rivers, nearer to the asset at risk. And again, what we're trying to understand here is there a difference that this management technique creates? And you can see here, rainfall event, the regenerative agriculture field soaks up the water, the field under conventional tillage does not. And so there will be a difference in runoff between these two fields, and that will affect the flashiness of the ditches, the streams, and so on. Now, if we can work out how much extra storage we're getting and compare that again with the peaks at the asset at risk downstream, then we can understand what proportion of the flood peak is reduced by that intervention. And then finally, we may be talking about much smaller interventions that are also considered as natural flood management in some extent. So SUDS interventions like this one here. This is the Climate Resilient Schools program. And again, we were monitoring that. This is a whole series of 300 of these that were installed in schools, planters, where water coming from roofs is going into these planters, filling up and slowing the passage of water into the urban drainage system, as well as providing co-benefits for environment and education. And of course, what we do there is we need a weather station, usually on the school roof, which again has educational co-benefits. We then need to measure the size of the roof that's draining into here to calculate the volume of water that's coming in. And then, of course, we measure the moisture dynamics in here to measure the extent to which that is stored versus drained. So here you see a rainfall event and the peak in storage and rather quick drainage for this particular planter back out. So again, we can calculate the percent of the total rainfall that's stored by a particular intervention, and therefore its efficacy and efficiency. In terms of overall findings from all these data, just some sort of big picture findings for you in the last few minutes we have here. If we're thinking about leaky dams, over all the ones that we monitored, I think our conclusion is that leaky dams can work if they're done well. Many of the leaky dams that we monitored, weren't doing a great job of reducing flows downstream, but some did. And the ones that did either had a large number of dams, 11 in a row here, 272 across the entire catchment at the time that we took these data. And, they were effective. We could see that the 11 in a row here were having an impact. And so large numbers of them would have a greater impact. So either they were very large or they were designed in such a way that they stored a lot of water. And in this case, there was a large number of them. And although, there were 272 dams that were affecting sub-catchments of the Stour here, even after building all of those, nearly 85% of the catchment was still, not covered by these features. But nevertheless, this is big enough to have made a difference. The other time when such things are effective is when they are designed to activate a floodplain, as is the case here with the leaky dams at Spain's Hall Estate. Now, of course, leaky dams have a big gap underneath them usually because they're designed not to affect low flows. So, it's not like they store water for long periods of time. They go up, when the river goes up very quickly, and then it goes down very quickly, but a little bit less quickly, perhaps than without the dam there. But a dam works well if it does exactly what this dam is doing. It raises the river just enough so that it floods a floodplain that you don't mind flooding, right? Because what you don't want to do is to flood the village downstream. And so, we had sensors on these, and we had a sensor on the floodplain, and we could see every time that, the floodplain was activated in this kind of way by a particular event. And from the air, that's what this looks like. There's a whole bunch of those leaky dams up here in Spain's Hall, and that has lifted the river enough that it's pushed over into this land. And all this water, therefore, is kept away from the village just downstream. We also worked a little bit in the last couple of minutes with beaver reintroduction, also at Spain's Hall, and what we find there, of course, is that, whoops, clicked that by mistake. What we find there, of course, is that they can make a contribution too. The interesting thing about beavers, of course, is that their dams are not so leaky. They contain a lot of water. They create a wetland, and they have co-benefits in doing that. But every time it rains, the beavers also extend the wetland. And so we saw over a number of years the storage levels increasing both in terms of height and in terms of total volume because of increases in extent as well as height of dams. And that was through individual events over a number of years. They're also self-repairing. So this is data from one of our level sensors in a beaver pound. And you can see this event last November, October, November, where the beavers indeed felled a tree by mistake, I guess, onto the dam, which then over 4 hours emptied. It then took them 18 hours to rebuild the wall, and it filled again. So that's a pretty quick repair. And again, turning a tiny thin channel here into a much more significant storage of water. Finally, regenerative agriculture, we find trumps all, because all of these interventions that I've talked about so far, they're point scale interventions. They're relatively small in extent. Whereas if you change the way that you farm soil, of course, you can have immediate impacts over very large areas in which a lot of rain falls. So I showed you this earlier on, the difference between RA and non-RA is very significant. If you multiply that over many hectares, you can have, an impact even on big rivers. that can be important, but it's not the same everywhere. This is another example where we have, regenerative agriculture here, conventional tillage here, different soil, very different effect, right? Almost no change there. So it's not a silver bullet because it doesn't work everywhere, but where it does work, it's useful. So finally, monitoring is fundamental to understanding and managing water. It's the only way to understand the effectiveness of small-scale interventions for which modeling is just unsuited. It's fundamental to parameterizing and validating models for scaling up those interventions, at the scales that models are more useful. Commercial monitoring equipment, especially data loggers and sensors, are expensive and difficult to maintain and use, especially in large sensor networks, because they're built by different companies, they're not well integrated and so on. Whereas low-cost open source designs are available, FreeStation, but also other projects out there that you can find. They require more work at the building stage, of course, but often come with smarter tools for data integration and analyses. It's always better, I think, to have many cheap data loggers than a few expensive ones in terms of resilience, for example. We have developed established experimental designs for monitoring the effectiveness of a range of water interventions, including NFM, which are available at the FreeStation website alongside the designs for the equipment. So that's all. I'll finish there. Thank you very much. Happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was a really interesting overview of some of these tools and the ways they can be applied, particularly around flood and drought management. So thank you so much for that. To all of our attendees, please do put your questions for Mark in the Q&A function. We're going to kick straight off into that now. I can see there's a couple in there already. So I wonder, Mark, firstly, this is just a quick question. So you mentioned about various store options and canopies and soils being the biggest stores of water. And I wonder if you could just provide a bit of information on where that information came from. Is this a particular paper that you'd cited or work that you've done in this area?
Yes, thank you. So yes, that's work that we've done over a number of projects, developing and then deploying this water world model. We've done this work at the global scale with that model because it's remote sensing based analysis, but we've also done it for individual countries like the UK. We have written on that. I can send details of a paper on that. And essentially what we do is we make some assumptions about the size of individual stores, wetland versus a water body versus a canopy, and then we map those stores across the landscape from remote sensing, and those two things together produce those storages. And the fact of the matter is that soil and canopies are so widely spread in the landscape that they're always going to be the biggest store, whereas water bodies and wetlands are maybe locally important, but at national scales they're much smaller, and certainly globally that's also the case.
Great, thank you. And then thinking about how this kind of technology can be applied in different areas, do you have any thoughts about some of the different areas you'd like to see it applied that's not been used for yet? And then the specific question is, how can this monitoring be applied for critical infrastructure, for example, along motorways?
Yeah, I mean, we're applying this kind of monitoring in all sorts of places in this catchment to coast project, because this part of Essex is very urbanized, so we are working along roads, and indeed we have done monitoring along of air quality, noise, and light pollution along roads of different sizes, including motorways. But I think that this stuff can be installed anywhere that you have landowner permission and where it's safe to work. So I think looking at critical infrastructure and thinking about hotspots where roads might flood it is a good use case for this stuff, particularly if you're going to deploy something that's then connected, so that you don't have to keep going to collect the data. The data is sent to you. And indeed, one of the images that I showed you of the leaky dams there, that was a project designed to stop flooding of a road rather than a residential area. And so it was, I think, again, about 10 leaky dams that were placed in a woodland next to a road to stop that road from flooding. Now, the monitoring we were doing there was monitoring the effectiveness of the dams rather than monitoring the flooding of the road. But I see no reason why the same technology couldn't be applied to looking at actual flooding at the sides of roads, as well as looking at the effectiveness of ways to solve that.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned a number of projects throughout your presentation where you would obviously have needed to engage with some key stakeholders, things like landowners, schools, and then also thinking about how the data from the findings is kind of fed into practice. How easy has it been to engage with all of these different stakeholders, and how open have they been to kind of the data that's been produced and also the process of the monitoring itself?
Thank you. That's a really good question. I think it's remarkably easy. People are remarkably interested in data, and so working with schools it can be challenging because you can only install and visit stations at certain times, and so on and so forth. But the actual level of engagement is always fantastic. Also because the data is online. All FreeStation data is automatically online. And therefore, we're always able to provide whoever we're working with a link to say, well, look, all the information is going to come in to this place, and you'll be able to graph it easily clicking this button. And so for schools, that's great. And for others too, particularly weather stations, people are quite keen to look at weather station data. They're obviously less interested in the levels of rivers and things like that. But I think most people are keen to know that someone's at least measuring these things, particularly the smaller streams and rivers that never get measured, right? That's someone is showing this little ditch outside Little Summit Tension for once, instead of just focusing on the big rivers.
Great, thank you. And are you aware of any low-cost monitoring options that exist for monitoring water quality? So things like nutrients, chemicals, or any aspects of water quality for diffuse pollution sources?
There are some, yes, and my colleagues at King's College London have a low-cost water quality sensor based, or set of sensors and a data logger based on Arduino. So if you look up, King's College London Arduino water quality, you will find the GitHub page for that with all the information. We have a few water quality sensors on FreeStation too, but water quality is always much more difficult and much more expensive to monitor well. You can get indicative data relatively cheaply, but if you want to monitor it well, then I think that the costs of these sensors aren't really used in other things. The only sensor that is the turbidity sensor. You can measure turbidity very cheaply because every washing machine has a turbidity sensor in it. But other things are much more expensive to monitor.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned that a lot of the data, or all of the data, do you say, goes online from these monitoring programs. In terms of people kind of using the open source designs and using the data that comes out of it, is there kind of associated training or support available to understand some of that stuff?
Well, what we've tried to do is we've tried to create an interface to the data that makes it easy to graph up the data online. So you don't, we know that from our students that sometimes the big problem in a lesson is getting a CSV file into Excel. That takes up half the lesson, right? So we try and sort of keep the technical things out of the way and have everything graphed up and viewable online. But in terms of specific applications, freestation.org has an applications sort of page, and on that we have a series of presentations like this one, but with a bit more detail, that say, okay, if you're interested in this application, then this is the kind of sort of monitoring strategy that you need, and you need to build these kinds of sensors, and then you need to look at the analysis in this kind of way using these functions on the platform. Because essentially we built these for us to be able to do that, because we were replicating our studies over many sites. It became very boring to do that very manually. So we built all this functionality so that we could do that. But now, of course, it's open, therefore anyone can benefit from that. It's not just sitting on some hard drive somewhere, and because it's all online and interactive functionality. So, that doesn't mean it's, everyone's going to go off and build a FreeStation. There are technical challenges once you move from operating software to building hardware. You need a small workshop, and you need some practical skills like soldering and so on. But we built these or designed these so that they could be built by geography students. You don't need to be an engineer. You just need to follow the instructions, but you do need to have a small workshop in order to do it properly.
That's great, thank you. And kind of related to that, is there scope for application of FreeStation monitoring overseas or examples of it happening already?
Yeah, we've done a lot overseas, and there are also some others who have built FreeStations overseas. Some of our earliest FreeStations are still in a rainforest in Peru collecting data, and we put them in 2014. I think that there's definitely applications overseas, and I think we also design them to be easily packed into a bag. Once you design your own equipment, you can take out all the problems that exist when you buy equipment. And so we worked out that we could fit 11 data loggers in a whole bag, right? We could fit 2 of the old style ones. So yeah, definitely overseas is a good area to do this, because again, you can build capacity in doing that, because as I said, these stations can be reconfigured, can be recycled. If something goes wrong, you just take that component out and replace it, because the components are never soldered in. Headers are soldered in, and the components are attached to those headers, so that there's not this issue of, okay, the station stopped working, I need to send it back to the UK. That doesn't happen.
That's excellent. Thank you. And then final question for today. Thanks for answering so many. Are there any guidelines or best practice manuals available on the kind of essential or minimum baseline monitoring that is required to kind of get meaningful data from these?
For natural flood management, there certainly are. For natural flood management, the Environment Agency have, in this next round of projects that they have just funded, they've produce some very comprehensive information on, okay, this is what we want you to measure. This is a sort of minimum standard, depending on the size of the project. Small projects, you need to measure this. Bigger projects, you've got to measure this as well. So, you can find that online. It doesn't really say how you measure it in terms of what types of equipment that you use, but it's what you've got to measure. And so we're working with a number of projects at the moment to support some of that kind of monitoring using this platform.
That's excellent. Well, thank you so much, Mark. That was a great presentation and really useful to hear an overview of these approaches. And thank you to all of our attendees for watching as well and logging in. I hope you found that really useful. If you are an IES member, don't forget to record your attendance using the IES CPD tool, which you can do by logging into the members area. And this webinar has been recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. If you are watching the recording on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel, like the video, and hit the bell to gain notifications of new content.